Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. It's Fran here, and we're looking at the Double Gameweek 26 cheat sheet preview. An absolutely massive week for all FPL managers. This is going to be one of the most explosive, high variance weeks, in my opinion, for a long time until we head into the kind of late 30s, where there are potentially going to be more doubles. We also have the blank game weeks of 27 and 30, and as I've always said, you have to base your team strategy and your transfers around that. I will generally say that this week I think the ceiling is completely around the midfielders, and most of my discussions, my talking points will be around the midfielders because I think they present the best kind of possibilities of earning points in this double game week situation. However, you still have to factor in whether you're investing into players in Arsenal, investing into players into Wolves, because what's interesting with Wolves is they do play in the blank of 27, they play in the blank of 30 as well. Whereas with Arsenal, they clearly do miss the blank of 27, and that's going to hurt a lot of players who are going to triple up into Liverpool this week. Your strategy in terms of chips, when it comes to a bench boost versus a triple captain of Salah or another Liverpool player, or even an Arsenal player if you're actually tempted, it is going to be called into question because if you, let's say, invest into 3 Liverpool players this week and maybe go into an Arsenal player, it's quite logical to actually go into a Ramsdale, for example, so that you can actually still have what should arguably be a playing 11 for the next week. Whereas if you go for, let's say, 3 Arsenal players and 3 Liverpool players, you're probably most likely going to play a free hit in 27. Those are the kind of situations you have to think about. If you're not going to Arsenal players, then maybe you could actually sidestep the free hit in 27, think about free hitting in 30, and play your team around that as well. Maybe a little bit more passively and cautiously this week, but there could be still quite a few interesting doubles to target. You have the Leeds double, you have the Spurs double to focus on. Even Burnley, arguably, over the next 2 weeks, if you don't plan on playing a 3 and 27, is a good focus point. Players like Weghorst, if he is fit, you have to kind of watch his injury news and wait for the latest updates from Sean Dyche. Even maybe investing into Cornet could be interesting, or even a Burnley defender slash goalkeeper such as Nick Pope or someone like a Tarkowski or me. We'll talk about them when we head into the defenders. But starting with the top of the defenders, the main issue here, I would say, is that the teams within United and Spurs have pretty much trailed off and not been very interesting in the last few weeks. United have had their doubles kind of come and go, and they've been great players to have in our team. Both Dalot and De Gea have, I think, turned out very nicely for most managers. On the contrary, I would say Spurs and Reguilon have looked worse and worse on a weekly basis. With United, it's clearly just a movement where they're heading into a tough run of fixtures. You have a great game versus Watford in 27, and then they have a bad run of form 28 and onwards where they face City and some tougher teams. Not only that, but I think other teams are trending in better directions when it comes to fixtures. Teams like Arsenal and Wolves have great fixtures and don't really have these sort of issues with blanks, barring Arsenal in 27. So that's the kind of situation we have. I think we have a change of the guard. We also have to remind ourselves that Chelsea will be fantastic options. Players like James will be coming back into our sides, especially if we're still looking at a 4 at the back approach. You can have a player like Mount replacing players like Bruno in the near future. If you've already taken Bruno out of your team for Salah, then still Mount is a great option because players like Zaha are good placeholders around that price range too that we can think about. With Dalot, he's the one who clearly falls for United. I don't think Shaw was always a great option, but he also falls very much in the same way. There's just not much interest, I would say, in keeping these United fullbacks because they haven't really been contributing too much from an underlying stats point of view. Yes, they're very active in terms of the passing maps, but I would say in terms of actually creating dead balls and final balls in the situations, I would say that they're not very involved. Right now, the midfield players, even Pogba, are much more interesting in this United team. The way Pogba has been reintegrated into the side. I would say Bruno, of course, has stepped up lately in the system. And Ronaldo, too, still, as I always say, is the focal point here. He had a great game versus Brighton. And as we head into a rough amount of United games, there's no real value in holding Dalot or Shaw. Reguilon is in a different situation where he has a double in 26. And honestly, as a Reguilon owner myself, I wouldn't be tempted to actually play Reguilon. The issue here that I can see is he probably plays this Man City game because he didn't get to play in the previous game versus Wolves, and they lost quite heavily without him. I wouldn't say this is kind of a sign for Conte to play Reguilon consistently because clearly the issue with Reguilon might not be his actual skills as a football player, but rather his fitness, and Conte not really banking or trusting into that. So that's going to be a factor where maybe he plays the game versus City, which is probably a dropping of the clean sheet, and then he might miss the game where Sessegnon could play versus Burnley, and that could pretty much take the whole point of having a Reguilon double out of our hands. I would much rather you invest into a cheaper Spurs defender who's more nailed, such as a Davies, or you could just go simply for someone like Son/Kane, who could be more interesting for the time being. as a general rule, I would say this week the focus is going to be on an Arsenal defender, depending on your strategy in 27. And then Wolves, I think, is that kind of team that is perfect for all sorts of scenarios. So a very kind of blank canvas transfer is going to be bringing in someone like Cody in your team. In terms of the Burnley defenders, I've already discussed them a little bit briefly because they have this double in 26 and then it's followed up by a double in 27. Now, Pope is a little bit more interesting as a keeper transfer, but he is very, very pricey. You have the option of getting Tarkowski or me, who are centre-back options. Me has actually scored 2 goals this season, so he could be a little bit more interesting than Tarkowski. But you also have the option of going for maybe a fullback and gambling a little bit more, although I would say that they play a very flat system, and I don't think fullbacks are very involved. You can look at the underlying numbers for Burnley, and that will tell you the same sort of story. The only interesting option ever really was going to be Lowton, and him kind of being taken out of the rotation due to a mixture of injury issues and also a little bit of rotation being setting into the squad is going to take him out of contention, I think, as a transfer this week. So I would say maybe think about Tarkowski and me if you're looking for a transfer and you really need to take out a defender this week. Otherwise, I would say focus your transfers on the midfield because there's not really much to say with the defenders this week. So let's actually head on into the midfielders. This week, I've actually added Gordon into the sheet. The main issue with Gordon, even though he's been playing so well lately under both kind of new managers in a sense, where Lampard is now the fixture kind of permanent manager, is that Ramsey pretty much occupies that place and probably is a slightly better option. I think as a goal scoring threat, Ramsey has been very consistent as that kind of runner in behind that a lot of people don't track because he plays very deep in midfield for the most parts of the game, but has an amazing gas tank if you can actually see some of his goals where they always come from basically solo runs or deep runs across the field from the halfway line. And Smith Rowe and Odegaard are going to be those kind of prime options where if you're not interested in going for a Saka this week, who I think is going to be the absolute priority when it comes to the kind of triple threat of the Arsenal midfielders, given that Martinelli has a suspension for the first game, means that I would say Saka goes in priority, but his additional price calls into question whether you could actually bring in a Smith Rowe and Odegaard. Odegaard, of course, is a visionary force, but that doesn't always pan out so well in FPL in terms of points. He has actually gotten a very consistent amount of goals and assists this season, more so than I would actually expect from a player of his caliber. And that's simply due to, I think, him being quite well integrated into the side as of late. Obviously, this Arsenal team has struggled a little bit from a creative point of view in the recent games. You've actually seen that most of their goals have actually come away from the midfield and away from players like Lacazette and more from players like Gabriel, for example. This is why I think if maybe you're looking at an Arsenal team, Ramsdale is a great priority transfer. Saka is as well, but so is someone like Tierney, who we didn't really discuss from the defender's position. The reason why I bring it up here is because you want to think about exactly how many Arsenal players you're happy to bring in this week, because it does affect how you plan to play around game week 27, and it could have potential good dividends for you in game week 30, as you'll be well prepared having enough Arsenal players for that kind of game week where, as I say, Arsenal has a great run heading towards the end of the season, and maybe you can switch things up if you have a wild card later on. I would probably say put Smith Rowe a little bit higher in priority than Odegaard, especially since he no longer has to kind of come off the bench in the first game, and maybe if he shows a great game in the first, he gets to keep his position over Martinelli. That's a strong possibility for me. And I think that could be a good situation where I would say Smith Rowe is probably a little bit more priority than Odegaard, but I would still put them in roughly the same tier with Saka being the primary option just because his position is always nailed. He doesn't really have the factor of being subbed off because there's not much of a threat from Nicolas Pepe, or at least so far we've seen this season. And that's kind of how I'd categorize these Arsenal midfielders. If we go next into another player from a different team, you're looking at Cornet from Burnley, who, as I said, has a double back-to-back game week. One of his issues this season has been dealing with niggling injuries. And the issue with him, I would say, is this Burnley team, if let's say Weghorst is truly injured, will have a kind of hampering effect on Cornet when he becomes the sole focal point of the team. And I think this team already struggles enough to make creative chances. Yes, they actually looked quite good versus Arsenal as an example. They've also built decent chances versus United and Liverpool, which were very tough matchups for Burnley. But ultimately, this is a team where I would say the actual quality of the players is quite low, and I think Sean Dyche has always overachieved with this team. So the fact that they're not really posting great underlying numbers doesn't really bear much fruit even when they play versus weaker opposition. And I would say that's the kind of issue I have with Burnley. I still think Cornet is worth a gamble because we've seen players like Rafinha kind of trail off in terms of form, and there's a lot of space now with with these double game weeks to kind of gamble on someone like a Cornet in the next few weeks. So you can definitely look at him as an option. Gallagher actually falls by contrast because he's not going to play versus Chelsea, and you have to look exclusively to his loan agreement. He is actually a Chelsea player, in fact, and he won't be playing this game versus Chelsea. So that kind of limits the potential of this game week for him. And obviously, I think if you're a manager who has had Gallagher for a long time, you could actually look at a side grade transfer this week, going to Zaha, who's a penalty taker for Crystal Palace, or you could move him on, as I said, to someone like a Saka this week, or even a Cornet if you're looking for a bit of a gamble. This week, I would say Crystal Palace don't have, the most interesting of ceilings when it comes to most of the doubles this week. I would put them around that Spurs tier, where one of their games is a very tough game versus Chelsea. I imagine Chelsea and City will both get clean sheets versus Spurs. That's my estimation. Obviously, we've seen that someone like Heung-min Son has done tremendously well versus City in the past, and I myself was actually relying on him to score versus City early in the season, which he did. So take that for what you will. But that's what I would pretty much say in terms of the situation with the Crystal Palace midfielders. Olise has a little bit of a weird position where, as I said, he's going to be a differential. And last week that kind of bared out where Edouard was starting in front of him. So his rotation with Edouard will kind of play a factor since Zaha is back into the side. And Zaha is the one who conversely rises. Bernardo Silva falls this week. I know it looks ridiculous because he's just scored a hat-trick versus Sporting in the Champions League, but it's really hard to kind of justify holding Bernardo Silva. I think he's just played much deeper in games where KDB has been playing alongside him. And not only that, but especially after such a great Champions League performance, I think a cool-off is probably going to be expected in this Premier League game. I highly doubt that he'll kind of continue with this run of form. In the Premier League, of course, he's been rather dry lately, same as Gundogan, and I think it's time for him to actually be taken out of teams because there's just a little bit more of a higher ceiling with some of the other doubles. Keep in mind, though, of course, that you have players like Sterling who continue to be playing exceptionally well. Sterling got a hat-trick last week. Mahrez, too, is an interesting option all the time. And it's tough to kind of switch between these Man City players and midfielders consistently. I would say that Foden and Sterling, from an underlying point of view, have always been and looked like the best options alongside Mahrez. Mahrez only kind of missing out due to AFCON and probably being out of our teams for that reason. And his price point is a little bit of a weird one because he is less of a permanent fixture than someone like Foden, who I would say is the most well-priced midfielder in this team, but perhaps doesn't necessarily have the same sort of ceiling as someone like Sterling, who we saw last week really explode. That's pretty much the assessment there. I don't think it's necessarily a priority transfer out for Bernardo Silva, but I think if you are the aggressive-minded player, this might be the time to take him out of your team if you haven't already, which I imagine you probably have. Going later into the list, I think KDB and Bruno rightly fall. The reason is simply just because I think you should be moving most of your money towards these double game week players, people who can actually have a higher ceiling, such as a Salah this week. It's very likely you also have maybe a double premium structure. But looking across at the interesting options this week, I would say most of them are priced around that kind of 6 to 7 range in terms of the midfielders. So actually having your midfield playing around a system where you're probably going for a 5 midfield piece with 1 premium, such as Salah, and then going for players like Jota, Foden, and things like that, or even Saka, for example, Rafinha, those sorts of players who have doubles, seems like the best sort of formation for this sort of week. I don't think a double premium is always that explosive when it comes to a double. It's usually having a well-rounded team that has a good assortment of doubles and also good fixtures. So that's why KDB and Bruno fall for me this week. And we'll see how things pan out in the future. I think the double up this season has proven to be, I would say, inefficient from a kind of price and economic point of view, unless you've had doubles, and these players don't have doubles, so that's pretty much why they fall. Mane is a rise this week. I think if you're looking for a differential captain, he could very well be it. He has got enough rest, I would say, from coming off that AFCON final and doing exceptionally well as the player of the tournament there. And Mane is probably set up to do extremely well. If you actually looked at the underlying numbers for the last 2 games, I would say Mane is actually far and above the leader outside of Jota, who had a great game versus Leicester as an example. But Mane seems like a great option and a very good differential against Salah if you really wanted to try that. And even if we cast our minds to last season, I think Mane was the difference maker actually in FPL between first and second place. So if you're interested in differentials, he's definitely it. But now let's actually head into the forwards and kind of round things out. Not much movement, in the kind of cheaper priced forwards. We know that this Watford team has doubles, but as I've always said, they've really trailed off in terms of creation. They're still going to be kept here because I think they're pretty much a minimum for 4 points. There's unfortunately no replacements for King and Dennis, for Roy Hodgson. I even if they're kind of running out of form, they're going to be players who will give you at least 4 points this week. So the ceiling, or at least the floor rather, is quite high. The ceiling is probably going to be quite low because this Watford team have looked very dire. Broja is a great option as we head into the kind of subsequent weeks. I've already seen managers actually bring Broja in just because they actually value that the Southampton team has actually built consistent chances versus top teams lately. And as we head into easier games for Broja, I'm sure he's going to be a fantastic option. Adams is going to be another added option just because with the kind of thoughts and feelings that I had with Broja, I think Adams has also stepped up quite a lot lately, and his underlying numbers have actually shot up in this kind of partnership setup with Broja. So I really expect Adams to have a strong kind of run towards the end of the season, especially since he's shown this kind of pickup in form. It was kind of like where he scored that goal versus Man City last season and rounded off the season quite well. That's kind of how I remember Adams at his peak. Antonio and Watkins, once again, it's another fall. They're just so invaluable as players. When you see Bowen in the same team as Antonio, still being cheaper than Antonio as well, doing exceptionally well and actually scoring on a consistent basis. Antonio has trailed completely off when it comes to production. He's no longer even providing assists, and that's why it makes a lot of sense for us to move into these players who have at least a double, or at least a player like Broja who has a great run of games ahead and actually is a contributor factory to his team's attack. Antonio has, I think, from even the eye test point of view, just not been very threatening. At his best, he probably looks interesting as someone who can maybe dominate off of a set piece, but that's not exactly why you're bringing in a player. I mean, and you might as well have Dawson in your team if you're kind of looking for that sort of foray. Unfortunately, Antonio just hasn't been that primary option. The same thing with Watkins, where I would say he is very good at making these kind of second forward runs, and he actually makes very good runs away from the defender. The team doesn't necessarily play around him, and I don't think chances reflect that. At the start of the season, I would say he was definitely the focal point of the team, but I think we've seen that the outlet recently clearly isn't Watkins. He's someone who probably actually is a decoy runner as opposed to the primary focal point of the team. The team doesn't play around him, and I think also Gerrard isn't necessarily too happy with his form anyways. So this is a good week to kind of drop Watkins. Jimenez is an interesting option. He's probably the one option here that I actually think about in terms of someone who's actually trending in around this price point alongside Lacazette, who are the more cheaper players. More expensive players this week from a forward position that we can definitely consider. I would say Lacazette is a nice little downgrade from a player like Ronaldo. If you're someone who's already invested a lot of money into forwards and isn't necessarily looking to downgrade completely, all the way into a Broja this week, Lacazette could be a very interesting double game we kind of pick up. Jimenez is an interesting option too. I wouldn't say his ceiling is very high. We've seen this Wolves team be extremely lackluster in terms of chance creation, but he is still very much the focal point, and Hwang coming in could be interesting. Although I have to mention that there were points in the season where Hwang was actually arguably the more interesting option because of Jimenez's ability to actually draw away defenders and then Hwang's ability to actually run off the kind of final man. So we'll see what happens as Hwang returns to the team. I just don't think Jimenez has a super high ceiling as a player, and especially with his Wolves side. Lacazette is a little bit more interesting, but that blank in 27 just doesn't really interest me too much, especially when you have kind of like for like options in the midfield with these Arsenal players, or even someone like Tierney, who has a very high ceiling for me on a game-to-game basis, especially in 2 games where he could very, very likely get 2 clean sheets. So Tierney for me is a more interesting pickup, even maybe more so than Saka this week. We round things off with the goalkeepers. We have Guaita hitting a rise just due to the double, Pope hitting a rise due to the double-double, and then De Gea and Lloris falling, just as I kind of explained with the defenders, as I mentioned previously, where clearly this Spurs team is hitting a downtrend. They're not going to bring in any personnel for the rest of the season. They clearly look out of sorts. This United team are heading into a slightly worse form as other teams have better games, better fixtures, and just more chances to really score points in FPL, even though De Gea has actually had, I would say, a standout individual season. And that's pretty much how I'd round things out with the cheat sheet. I hope you guys have a wonderful week ahead. I will be doing the live stream this week. Sorry for missing out in the previous week. And I'll catch you guys as well on the team selection video, where hopefully we have a little bit more of an updated plan for this week, where there should be a lot of massive plans kind of in action and kind of flowing through my head. So I'll see you guys very shortly.